There's a war on, and not enough people know it. I'm not talking about the Third World War warming up nicely between Russia and the West over the weeping sore that is Ukraine, but the silent war waged by Parliament against we the people. It's not just between us Brits and our Parliament. Similar wars are being waged elsewhere in the West by governments against those they seek to govern, or rather to dominate. But the war being waged here against us in these islands may be the most important. Here in Britain, they like to tell us we have the Mother of Parliaments. It's hardly true, but it's a good line for the tourists. But if our Parliament wins this war, it will have consequences for the whole of the West and the whole of the world. Those aware of the silent war know it's been going on for many years. Some learned souls will tell you it's been the stuff of decades, if not centuries, passed between generations of politicians and others. The strategic objective is total control of the people. This is being achieved not by bullets and bombs, but by stealth, sleight of hand and the misuse of legislation. Those in pursuit of centralised power, of a one-world government, hate, and with every fibre of their being, sovereign nation-states. That said, they reserve a special loathing for national constitutions that define the rights of people in perpetuity. Total control of the sort the state has in mind requires the hoodwinking of the people into thinking Parliament is the highest power in the land, that they tell us what to do. It's interesting to note that hoodwinking is a term from the art of falconry, whereby a falcon with lethal talons, the swiftest attacking flight and the sharpest eyesight of all living creatures, is kept docile and under control simply by having a little hood placed over its head. I called it a silent war, and I mean it. Do you hear the dissenting voices? Can you hear the rage? No, that's because you're not meant to. For those involved, it feels like most people in the country are behind soundproof glass. No matter how loud the drumming with fists on that glass, too many carry on regardless. It feels like a bad dream in which disaster is looming in the form of a giant wave or a wall of flame, and yet no one hears the alarm being raised. Now we're in the end game of this war, and fortunately for us, right in the closing stages, over these last 2 years or so, Parliament and those who would control our Parliament finally overplayed their hand, and by the high-handed application of disastrous and draconian policies inadvertently woke too many people up to the ruse that's being played on them. It's as though after all those years of distance run, the last bunch handed the baton of the relay race for the sprint to the finish line have proven to be the clumsiest clowns, tripping over their own feet. So much power seized so quickly went to their heads. But for all that, we have to concede that they tried their damnedest to get over the line, and they're definitely still trying. For these last 2 or 3 years, the underdogs caught up in the silent war have literally been silenced, forced to shut up. I've always considered myself to be about as mild-mannered as they come, obedient to rules, respectful of authority. If you told me a few years ago that I'd be censored here in the UK for asking questions, I'd have scoffed. But here we are, and here I am, like so many others, increasingly subject to censorship online. Too many broadcasters and journalists in this country, those inclined to speak up about blatant wrongs by authority, have simply been silenced, and far too many have been willingly and enthusiastically complicit in the slavish transmission of Parliament's message and the suppression of contrary views. And yet, 3 years later, and all manner of silenced views, those that were called misinformation or ridiculed as conspiracy theory have been proven correct after all. Scientists, doctors and other health professionals, a handful of journalists, people from all walks of life had their reputations trashed, their livelihoods destroyed, and yet they were right all along. But still the censorship and silencing goes on. Bill Gates, the self-appointed Lord God Almighty of science and vaccines, has himself come out and admitted the so-called vaccines he pushed on everyone don't work as advertised. But if I quote him on some online channels, that content comes down. The so-called vaccines are being withdrawn for the under 50s, and yet to ask why, when those products are still described only as safe and effective, is to invite yet more silencing. Last week we learned, like it was any kind of surprise, that the government had deployed spies and sneaks to record dissenting voices and seek to have their voices silenced. Among them, the 77th Brigade, a PSYOPs unit of the British Army that uses social media to help the government control the narrative and push its propaganda. MP Tobias Ellwood, chairman of the Defence Select Committee, and in my opinion a spy master and warmonger, is the brigade's lieutenant colonel. Around the world it's the same. Outspoken Canadian psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson has been threatened with the removal of his licence to practice unless he submits to, quote, social media re-education. In other words, stop saying what you're saying or there will be consequences. In this war, silence is the principal weapon. It's ruthlessly wielded by Parliament and its lackeys. Worse by far, though, is to silence yourself. Once the silence is accepted as the safest way, the only way, then the war is over. Now is the time to make noise, a lot of noise. Make no mistake, this is the end game. All of their weapons are in plain view. Digital IDs are almost with us. The framework of central bank digital currencies is already here. Surveillance cameras are everywhere, even in our phones and on the screens we carry every day. 15-minute cities are the new lockdown, the new ghettos. Everywhere they're proposed, they're opposed by the majority of the people. And what happens? The councils have the audacity to ride roughshod over supposed democracy and impose them anyway, expressly against the wishes of the people. None of us voted for any of this Agenda 2030 nonsense. And does that matter? Not as far as the so-called leaders are concerned. They just do it anyway. And always it's the so-called climate crisis, the greatest hoax of modern times. That's the stick being used to beat us. The justification for making us poorer, colder, hungrier, restricted in every way and monitored 24 hours a day. With all this ranged against us, what can we do? For a start, we can speak out, learn the power of no to all of it, march and protest before they pass legislation making that illegal as well. But our principal weapon, in many ways the only weapon we need, is right here under our noses. Believe it or believe it not, scoff if you will, but it's our national constitution. Given that we're a constitutional monarchy, and in May we are to watch crowned our new constitutional monarch in the form of King Charles III, right now is the perfect time to remember and be re-educated about what our constitution says and means. To cut to the chase, it exposes the lie, the blatant lie that Parliament is sovereign. Our constitution makes plain that Parliament is not and never can be sovereign. Our constitution is older than Parliament, came before there was such a thing as Parliament, and so no Parliament can alter it, far less ignore it. Parliament is bound by the Constitution and yet cannot touch it. This fact alone must drive the would-be tyrants and despots in Westminster up the wall with centuries of frustration. Only we the people are sovereign. Only we the people have the final say, the absolutely final say on our governance. If you won't take my word for it, how about that of John Adams, founding father and second president of the United States? Quote, should it be argued that a government like this, where the sovereignty resides in the whole body of the people, is a democracy, it may be answered that the right of the sovereignty in all nations is unalienable and indivisible and does and can reside nowhere else. Most importantly of all, even though the vast majority of people have deliberately been made unaware of this crucial fact, is that only we the people have the power to judge the justice of the laws we choose to live by. This is not some obscure legal talk. This is simple, fundamental, and, which is most important of all, true. It should be on T-shirts and badges. Every child should be taught this above all. Any government that empowers itself to write legislation and also to impose the punishment for breaching that legislation is a tyranny. Any people that submits to the idea that the government both makes the legislation and enforces it is a people living under a dictatorship. This power, this absolute power of the people, is wielded via the jury. Generations of people in this country have been miseducated into overlooking this power. But the undeniable fact is that every jury has the power to judge the very justice of the law. When a jury hears a trial, even if it's proven beyond doubt that legislation, a law, has been broken, the jury may still set the accused free. Indeed, if trial by jury is being exercised as defined by the Constitution, even one juror finding the accused not guilty must result in a not guilty verdict. If you listen to this and think the power of the jury is awesome, that is because it truly is. And that's why we must never allow any here today and gone tomorrow government to try and persuade us otherwise. Every day that passes when we allow our government and our judiciary to blind us to that awesome truth is another day closer to abject tyranny and to the rule of despots. I mentioned King Charles. If we do, in fact, live still in a constitutional monarchy, then the constitutional monarch must swear an oath to protect the rights of the people, not the rights of Parliament, not of the government, but the people against all comers. For more than 1,000 years, our constitutional monarchs, Queen Elizabeth II included, have sworn also to protect our national borders. Our democracy is founded upon the unquestioned, unchallenged sovereignty of the people. The monarch swears to protect our liberties without exception. If anyone tells you that our Constitution, founded upon Magna Carta 1215, has been set aside or superseded, is simply and profoundly wrong. Here's the thing, and here's how we win the war. Either we live in a democracy in the form of a constitutional monarchy, or we don't. If we don't, then Parliament better at least have the decency to tell us so, and furthermore to explain when and how that happened. We are free people and sovereign. We're not granted that freedom by Parliament, but by the bedrock of our Constitution, indeed by the universe itself. That Constitution is much older than Magna Carta, which was only a 1215 restatement of what was already true and understood and made real by the much older common law. I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it until the silence is overwhelmed and we begin the long task of remembering that we cannot be told what to do by government. That truth is final and can only be denied by those who either don't know it or who do know it and are lying. All of that's my opinion, of course it is, and you're free to disagree with me. So keep your tweets and emails coming all through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet as well at gbnews. I'll try to get to some of your comments later in the show. With me tonight, the businesswoman and campaigner Emma Sale and author and journalist Nick Tyrone. Emma, do you feel that you understand how much power you have as a sovereign individual in the face of anything the government tells you to do?
I think if my mum was sat on the sofa by you, she'd probably say since she was born. I realise it, and I think it's been frustrating. I think the last 3 years have been unbelievably frustrating, watching that power taken away for no reason and people just going along with it. And, you know, the whole COVID mandates of this is what we're going to do. And, you know, just I think last week, I wanted to smash the TV watching Hancock sit there and say he didn't break the law. They were just guidelines. And I sat there going, hang on a minute. It was just me looking back 3 years ago. No, that was pretty much clear that you were breaking the laws. You'd be fined. You could be locked up. Then these were the law.
Jobs.
People lost their, jobs. People didn't sit there with, dying relatives, left, right and centre, because we were following the new laws that were decreed to us when COVID hit. And, so...
Nick, do you think... I think this should be in the schools. I think we need a re-education programme to let people know from the ground up that they count, that they are sovereign, and that they can stand in the face of authority and the government and challenge them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think as a culture, we've become... It's very strange. I'm writing an article at the moment this weekend on sensitivity readers at publishing houses, just to let everybody know what this is. Basically, if you have a book, what you do is you work on it with your editor, and then it's all ready to go, and then someone who's a sensitivity reader reads it for anything that could conceivably be offensive to literally anyone. And so, yeah, we have a very... You were talking about, how this is coming from government, but actually it's sort of not necessary in a lot of places. There's so much self-censorship that's going on in places that really there shouldn't be. I mean, in publishing, I think back to in books like Tropic of Cancer or Naked Lunch or any number of... We go through them, controversial books. I mean, it was the publishing industry against the establishment that was trying to say, no, freedom of speech, whoever's offended by something that's in these works.
I had a novel run afoul of a sensitivity reader.
Did you?
Years ago now. I mean, right back.
Right.
Before any of this nonsense. But
right.
5, 6, 7 years ago, I had a novel cancelled for precisely that.
Yeah.
But what troubles me, though, is the way in which people think that because a government makes a law, passes it through the Commons, and it becomes enacted and as a law, that's it. That's it. When in fact, the Constitution specifically states that the jury can disregard that law as being not good enough, as being inappropriate, wrong.
Well, it's a complex subject. I was thinking about this in terms of
But it's been made complex so that people don't know it.
Well, indeed.
I think it's law.
Yeah, but I was sort of thinking about this through a sort of Rousseau versus Hobbes, maybe that's too intellectual, I don't know, but, kind of lens whereby How much do we need a sort of, I mean, just playing devil's advocate, how much do we need a sort of strong government that will lay down the rules sometimes?
We'll come back to this very subject after the break, but we've got that upon us now. We will get back into this discussion about whether we live in a constitutional democracy or not, and I'll have an expert here in the studio to tell us more. Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. In May, we will be invited to watch the coronation of our constitutional monarch. For most, it will be nothing more than a fancy pants ceremony full of pomp and circumstance, lots of colour and pageantry. How many, though, will pause to consider how central and fundamental to our constitution is the crowning and anointing of the monarch? My next guest, constitutional expert Will Keat, joins me to consider, and this is a question that troubles me greatly, whether or not we live in a constitutional democracy. Will, thank you for joining us. When this is something that goes to the fundamental power that each of us has, why have we all forgotten it or never been told it?
I think largely that's because we've had it educated out of us. And so we were just talking about that before, and why is that the case? I think there's been some fun and games going on behind the scenes, because it's not good for a political power to have a citizenry that is properly aware of its constitutional powers. So,
but it is true, is it not, that it is the people, it's never Parliament that's sovereign.
Correct.
It's always it's not meant to be
correct.
Parliament.
Yes. As long as your constitution is based on common law, that would be described as a proper democratic constitution, not because of voting in elections. And we'll come on about that later, because that's actually adult suffrage. But the term democracy actually means something else. So there's another concealed, hidden mechanism within the Constitution that's sort of been rather airbrushed out of our consciousness over a very long period of time.
And that, as I mentioned and touched on at the top of the show, it is the jury, isn't
yes.
it? That people just think they just go in there, 12 obedient people, judge more or less tells them what to do, and there's a verdict, and that's an end of it.
Yes.
But what is the function of the jury, really?
Yeah, so the jury, I mean, we all know the first function of the jury, which is essentially to judge the accused person before the court. But the hidden, concealed second purpose of the jury, that's the key. And what that is actually to judge the justice of the piece of legislation that brought the defendant into court. So to put that another way, you're actually, as a jury, judging two things. So when the defendant comes into court, you're judging the defendant, but you're kind of weighing that and balancing it against the piece of legislation, the statute, that actually brought them into court. And the jury has the right, the independent right, to judge on the justice of that piece of legislation as well.
So the jury is not bound by that legislation?
No.
In any sense?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. So this is called jury independence. Now, I mean, they're a bit coy about this, and that's why we're not being told. It's a very concealed concept. And generally speaking, juries are not told of their power and their right to judge the justice of the law. But they are absolutely, they have the right to judge on that independently of the legislation.
So, you know, in the last couple of years, when legislation was coming down and there was emergency powers and all of the rest of it, and we were invited to think that, well, it's an emergency and you'll just have to do what you're told.
Yes.
That wasn't the case in terms of the independence of the jury.
Well, OK, so it's a little bit more complicated than that, simply because as soon as they shouldn't be passing legislation through Parliament, through the legislature, and there are a number of checks and balances that are meant to be in place to make sure that legislation, acts of Parliament that are proposed through bills of Parliament are meant to be checked, first in the upper house and then, of course, through the royal prerogative. And a lot of people get a bit fussy about the royal prerogative, but they don't actually realise that that's a protection mechanism for legislation that would be contrary to the Constitution and contrary to the liberties of the people.
We are invited, aren't we, to think that the crown, the monarch, is just a figurehead. But that's not and cannot be true.
No, they're the highest ranking public servant in the land. They're the first among equals.
And whose side are they meant to be on?
Well, they're meant to be on the people's. They're meant to be protecting the people's liberties. Yeah, absolutely. That's the point of the Constitution.
And so
they are the sovereign. but they cede sovereignty to the people through that power of jury independence, trial by jury. That's how it's meant to work.
And so,
it's not how it's working now.
And so in terms of, you know, when what happened while we were within the European Union,
yeah.
how lawful was that the national final decision-making power, the sovereignty, was ceded to Brussels?
Yeah, completely unlawful, yeah. Yeah, absolutely contrary to the Constitution.
I mean, is this a functioning democracy or not?
OK, so it depends on what you mean by the term democracy, because there's been a bit of a twist in that word. And of course, we're taught, or conditioned, if you like, into thinking that the term democracy actually is all about voting in elections. It's about the majority vote, and it's not actually. That is adult suffrage. The real meaning of democracy is specifically the emplacement of a mechanism into your constitution that allows the people, through the jury, to be the final arbiter of law. And that tradition goes all the way back through early England, the English constitutional common law, prior to 1215 Magna Carta, the late Saxon kings, into Europe as well. Most of the European nations were functioning on common law as well. And then even back into the Athenian constitution in Greece.
Nick, we've been hoodwinked, have we not? Or is it just me that we don't get told this? We're not invited to know this about the powers that we have, which strikes me as fundamentally sinister. All these powers are there in our Constitution, which we are supposed to care about. But if you actually make people aware of what's in the Constitution, it fairly knocks the knees out from the government.
I mean, I suppose I'd probably put it on the other... I'd probably put it like this. I mean, you know, voting in a general election is like, what, usually about 60% turnout, something like that? So we can't even get people... All they have to do is go to a ballot box and, you know, vote for somebody, and actually just getting them to care that much about it. I remember trying to register people outside of an ASDA once. Oh, my God. I mean, just literally just, can you just take this form? I don't do that. That's not for me. Like as if I was trying to sell them something. It was remarkable.
Emma, it's dismal, isn't it? The disenfranchisement
I
of
think
people
that
from their own power.
It's that, and also, you know, it's even though people have the power to vote, most people know, well, we're political nomads especially after the last 3 years, and even before that, the last decade, is, well, what are you voting for? Who are we voting for? Do we trust who we're voting for? And, you know, the behaviour, it's just been an absolute, cesspit of incompetence. And it's like, well, how do you know who to vote for?
As Nick says, no wonder people get disenchanted by it, because it changes nothing. And so people have that pushed at them. Oh, vote, yes, vote, that's your decision-making power. And what's being hidden from them is the fact that regardless of what the government is, you can intervene at any stage via the jury to say, that legislation's nonsense.
It's a much more direct power, constitutionally, that we actually have. That's how the people have the authority over their own governing administration, through that mechanism. But the whole sort of introduction and the increase in the size and stature of Parliament is, in a way, all about that obfuscation and that confusion in the minds of the people. In that, actually, we've now arrived at a situation where we believe that the influence, and that's really all it is a little bit of influence here and there, is actually through this mechanism of voting in elections. But actually, when you think about that system, the party political system, really only emerged in the sort of mid-1700s. And yet we talk about democracy as something, having come from this sort of ancient history going back to the time of Greece. It's actually the time of Cleisthenes. It's prior to Plato and Socrates.
They invited us to forget our power.
Yeah.
And all they handed us was the opportunity every now and again to vote for one or other cheek from the same bottom.
Yep.
And that's supposed to be a democracy. Well, thanks so much. I could talk to you endlessly about this. Please come again and tell us more. Such an important topic with the coronation coming up in May. It's another break already.